In the year 1700, India stood as one of the most prosperous lands on earth. Her share of the global economy was almost 27% greater than all of Europe combined. Across its vast plains and glittering cities flowed rivers of trade art and invention. The fabric of Indian civilization was woven from silk and steel, from knowledge and enterprise. But 2.5 centuries later, when the sun finally set on the British Empire, India's share of the world's wealth had fallen below 3%. The question that haunts history is simple. What happened to the richest nation on earth? The answer begins in 1707, when the death of Emperor Aurangzeb shattered the Mughal Empire. What had once been a stable realm now cracked under the weight of ambition and rebellion. Across the subcontinent, rival princes fought for the peacock throne, armies marched, cities burned, and loyalty was bought and sold. India's unity faltered, and its defenses weakened. Then came the predators from across the seas. The Persian emperor Nader Shah invaded in 1739. His soldiers stormed Delhi and carried away mountains of treasure, including the famed peacock throne. Yet Nader Shah departed. Once his coffers overflowed, he came to plunder, not to rule. But others watched and learned among them a new foreign power with colder intentions. The British East India Company. The British had come as traders. Their ships filled the ports of Surat, Calcutta and Madras, bearing spices, silk, and gold. But as the Mughal power waned, the British saw something far more valuable than trade. They saw an empire ripe for taking. Unlike the Persians or the Huns, they did not wish to conquer and leave. They wished to stay. They wished to own India forever, in their eyes. India was not a civilization, but an endless gold mine. The land that had once dazzled the world with its industry would soon become the engine that powered Britain's rise to global dominance before the storm. India was a wonder of industry. A traveler arriving from Europe or America would have seen a land of immense skill and sophistication. Cities like Dhaka and Surat thrived on trade. Bengal's looms produced fabrics so fine that they were compared to woven air. The region's textiles adorned kings and queens across continents, while its metals and jewels filled palaces from Istanbul to London. India was a world leader in textiles, shipbuilding, and metallurgy. It was said that 1/4 of all cloth traded on the planet came from Indian weavers. The trade routes that spread from its shores carried not only goods, but culture, language, and ideas. Villages along the coasts of Andhra and Gujarat echoed with the rhythm of looms and dyeing vats where artisans perfected their craft generation after generation. The shipyards of India were no less mighty. From the ports of Calicut and Quilon to Bengal, thousands of vessels were built each year, crafted from teak and iron by men whose ancestors had sailed the Indian Ocean for millennia. In the early 1700s, Bengal alone commanded a merchant fleet of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying vast cargoes of goods. British observers admitted that Indian ships were stronger and longer lasting than their own vessels built in Bengal could survive for more than 20 years, twice the life of those built in England. The skill of Indian blacksmiths, too, was legendary. They forged the finest steel the world had ever known. Woots steel, they called it, in the West, Damascus steel to others. Its blades could cut through lesser metal without losing an edge. From the Deccan to the Malabar coast, this ancient craft supplied warriors and nobles alike, and its fame reached the farthest corners of the known world. India was not only rich in goods, but in mines. Its merchants and financiers managed complex networks of credit and exchange that connected Asia, Africa, and Europe. It was a land that had mastered trade, science, and art in equal measure, and then came the British, and with them came ruin. The British East India Company began as a merchant venture, but it soon turned into a monster of conquest. Once they secured military control, they rewrote the rules of India's economy to serve their own purpose. The first step was simple: destroy the industries that made India. Strong textiles were the lifeblood of Indian commerce. The British seized control of them. They imposed a monopoly that forbade Indian merchants from selling abroad. The weavers who had once supplied the world were now forced to sell only to the company. The British paid them not in hard currency, but in tax revenue that had already been taken from Indians themselves. It was theft disguised as trade. When British manufacturers realized they still could not compete with Indian craftsmanship, they turned to violence. Soldiers were sent to break looms, to cripple workshops, and even to maim the artisans who refused. To yield stories spread of weavers whose thumbs were crushed so they could never weave again. In London, the textile mills hummed with stolen skill, while in Bengal, silence fell over the once busy workshops to finish the job the British imposed, crushing tariffs of up to 80% on Indian goods entering Britain, while flooding India with cheap machine-made cloth. The effect was devastating. Entire cities of artisans fell into poverty. Skilled craftsmen became beggars and farmers. The subcontinent that once clothed the world was stripped naked of its dignity. The same story unfolded across every craft. Indian steel was banned. Indian ships were taxed. Indian merchants were replaced by British intermediaries. India became a mere supplier of raw materials. Cotton, iron, and opium flowed out while British manufactured goods poured in at high prices. India was no longer a producer, but a market, a colony enslaved by economics. By the late 19th century, less than 1% of Indians worked. In manufacturing, millions of artisans were forced back to the soil, swelling the ranks of desperate peasants. Dr. Charles Hall wrote that India's people had been thrown back upon the land because Britain's policies had ruined every branch of native industry. The countryside soon became a prison. The British taxed the farmers with brutal efficiency, demanding between 50 and 80% of all produce even before the harvest began. Many peasants owed more in taxes than they could possibly earn. The British Parliament boasted of this revenue, calling it proof of efficient administration. They even admitted that Indians were taxed at 3 times the rate of any previous ruler. To enforce these taxes, officials used terror. Defaulters were locked in cages under the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to pay their dues. Villages were stripped bare. When families failed to pay, the British confiscated their fields, creating millions of landless peasants for the first time in India's history. By the end of the 19th century, India had become Britain's greatest source of revenue, its biggest market, and its most exploited possession. Civil servants, soldiers, and traders all drew their salaries from Indian taxes, even as Indians themselves starved. One British Prime Minister, the Marquis of Salisbury, said it plainly: "India is to be bled of money, and the lancet must be directed where the blood is thickest." And bleed it did. Modern economists estimate that the total wealth taken from India during British rule amounts to over $43 trillion. Unlike the Mughal rulers who, though foreign, made India their home, the British remained distant and alien. They extracted India's wealth but gave nothing. In return, they did not build to unite. They built to drain. Every penny that left Indian shores was gone forever. Some argue that Britain gave India the railways, that they brought progress and modernity. But even this gift was poisoned. The railways were not designed to serve Indians, but to extract their resources faster. They were built with British steel, British engines, and British capital. The Indian taxpayer paid the bill and guaranteed profits for British investors. Every mile of track in India cost almost 10 times what it cost in the United States, yet every rupee of profit went to London. The trains carried not food to the hungry, but grain to the ports. From there, it was shipped to Britain even in times of drought and famine. When crops failed and millions starved, British policy forbade relief. Their goal was to keep exports steady even as bodies filled the fields. Between 1876 and 1902 alone, tens of millions died of preventable hunger. Famine was not a tragedy of nature. It was a weapon of empire. British officers recorded the horror in their own words. Corpses piled into wells. Mothers sold their children. Husbands drowned their starving wives to spare them suffering. Yet the British government ordered its press to stay silent. The official line was clear: do not acknowledge that people are dying of hunger. India was a land that once overflowed with grain and gold, but under the British it became a graveyard of famine and despair. Historians now estimate that over 35 million Indians perished from starvation under British rule, more than all the deaths under Stalin, Mao, and Hitler combined. And yet the myth of benevolent empire persists. They say the British gave India modernity, railways, education, law. But what good is a railway that serves only to carry away your food? What justice exists when your wealth is used to pay the salaries of those who oppress you? What education can flourish when a nation is too hungry to learn? When independence came in 1947, the land that had once been the jewel of the world lay exhausted. Its industries destroyed its farmers, impoverished its people, divided by policies that deepened every wound of caste and creed India had been unmade by 2 centuries of calculated exploitation. The British called it civilization. They said they had brought light to a dark land, but the light they carried was the fire of looting torches that burned through.